The first sign of trouble, hook and suspense. Emerges empire. In the vast expanse of space, there was a deep silence. The galaxy had been at peace for decades. The humans had built a strong empire, known for their bravery and determination. Their fleet was spread across many planets, protecting their people, keeping the peace, and making sure nothing would threaten their way of life. But today, that calm was about to shatter. A small routine ship, the Valiant, was floating in a quiet part of space, far from the bustling human colonies. The crew, a mix of seasoned soldiers and young recruits, were relaxing. They had no idea that their lives were about to change. The ship's radar officer, a sharp young woman named Lieutenant Sarah, was sitting at her station, casually monitoring the usual signals. She had grown used to the quiet, distant stars and the lack of threats. But then something strange happened. Her console beeped sharply, a signal that wasn't part of the usual space traffic. At first, it was a weak, low-frequency pulse, almost like a whisper in the vastness of space. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she tapped a few buttons, trying to get a clearer picture. The signal didn't match anything in the system. It wasn't human, and it certainly wasn't anything she recognized. "Captain, you need to see this," Sarah said, her voice low and urgent. Captain Jace, a strong and experienced leader, walked over to her station. He had seen a lot in his years of service, but this was different. The calm, steady rhythm of space had always made him feel secure. But this moment was an unsettling interruption. "What is it, Lieutenant?" he asked, his voice steady, but his eyes scanning the radar. He could tell something wasn't right. "I'm getting an odd signal, Captain. It doesn't match any known ships. It's faint, but it's there. I've never seen anything like this before." Captain Jace frowned. "Can you get a more accurate reading?" Sarah worked quickly, her fingers moving over the controls. The signal became a bit clearer, and the screen flashed with more information. It was coming from deep space, way beyond their usual patrol route. The distance was far, but the signal was growing stronger. "It's not a simple radio pulse, sir," Sarah added. "This is deliberate. Someone, or something, is trying to reach us." The captain's mind raced. They had heard rumors in the past, whispers of an ancient, hidden enemy fleet. Some said it was just a myth, a story passed down through generations. Others believed it was nothing more than a far-off dream. But the growing signal on the screen didn't seem like a story. This was real. He stood still for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "Send a distress signal back to headquarters. We need to know if anyone else has picked up on this." "Aye, Captain," Sarah replied, her fingers dancing over the communication panel. The message was sent, but as she looked back at the radar, the signal seemed to grow even stronger, more urgent. Her eyes widened. "Captain, it's getting closer." Jace turned to face the rest of the crew. The calm and steady atmosphere that had filled the room was now gone. Everyone could feel the change. The small group of soldiers, engineers, and officers that made up the Valiant's crew exchanged nervous glances. They were trained for conflict, but nothing had prepared them for this. "We don't know what's out there," Captain Jace said, turning back to his crew. "But whatever it is, we'll be ready. Prepare the ship for possible enemy contact." The crew immediately began moving into action. The hum of the ship's systems increased as they powered up the weapons, the shields, and everything else that would be needed in the event of a fight. Jace remained calm, but his mind was racing. The last thing he wanted was to scare his crew. But deep down, he knew this could be the beginning of something much bigger than they were prepared for. In the crew quarters, Sarah sat quietly at her station, watching the signal grow stronger on the screen. She couldn't help but feel a chill run down her spine. What were they really up against? Was this some kind of mistake, or was it something more dangerous? The enemy fleet, if it existed, had been gone for so long. But now, with this mysterious signal reaching them, it felt too real to ignore. As she stared into the depths of space, a single thought echoed in her mind. What if the legends were true? Back in the bridge, Captain Jace was still focused on his mission. He knew that there was no turning back. If the enemy was truly coming, they would have to face them. And the galaxy would watch as the humans faced their first real test in years. But they were not prepared for what was coming next. No one could have predicted it. The Valiant continued to drift through the silence of space, the radar beeping steadily, marking the approach of something unknown. Something vast. Something that would change everything. A close encounter. The Valiant continued to sail through the endless darkness of space, the mysterious signal growing ever stronger. Every member of the crew had their eyes fixed on their screens, and the tension was palpable. It had been hours since Lieutenant Sarah first detected the signal, but now it was unmistakable. The enemy fleet was on the move, heading straight toward them. Captain Jace paced back and forth on the bridge. He had seen a lot of strange things in his career, but nothing like this. This felt different. There was an almost oppressive weight in the air, as though the galaxy itself held its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. "Lieutenant, give me an updated reading," Captain Jace ordered, his voice steady, but with an edge of urgency. Sarah's fingers flew over the console, her heart racing. The radar had gone from weak to strong. The signal no longer just a distant whisper, but a clear, forceful presence in their system. "It's definitely coming closer, Captain. And it's big. I can't pinpoint the exact size yet, but this isn't just one ship. We're talking about a fleet." The captain's eyes narrowed. A fleet. The human forces were strong, but they hadn't faced an enemy on this scale in decades. A sudden wave of uncertainty washed over him, but he quickly pushed it down. There was no time for fear. They had to act, and they had to act fast. "Prepare to send out a fleet-wide distress signal," Captain Jace commanded. "We need backup. Now." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her voice sharp as she typed in the coordinates. The call for help was sent out to the nearest human colonies, and the response would take time. But time was something they didn't have much of. The Valiant's weapon systems hummed to life, powered by the ship's engines as they prepared for the worst. Shields went up, and the crew scrambled into their battle stations. Every soldier, engineer, and officer on board was ready. The crew had been trained for moments like this, but facing an unknown enemy, one they had only heard about in stories, was something none of them had ever imagined. "Captain," Lieutenant Sarah said, her voice tight with concern. "The signal. It's now showing a series of numbers. It looks like a code, maybe even a message." Jace moved quickly to Sarah's console, leaning over her shoulder to examine the screen. The numbers flickered on the display, an unfamiliar pattern. He didn't have the code-cracking skills of the ship's analysts, but he knew enough to recognize that this wasn't just random noise. Could it be a warning? Sarah asked. A declaration of war, or maybe something else. "We don't know yet," Jace answered, his mind racing. "But it's only a matter of time before we find out." Minutes passed, but the crew's nerves were stretched taut as they waited in silence. Every hum of the ship's engines felt like an eternity. The enemy fleet, whatever it was out there. And with each passing moment, they were getting closer. Then, just as the crew started to think the worst was over, the ship's radar emitted a sharp, alarming beep. The screen blinked, and there it was, a massive silhouette on the edge of the radar. "Captain," Sarah shouted, her voice full of disbelief. "I have a visual. It's huge, and it's not alone." On the main view screen, a massive ship appeared, slowly taking shape as it entered their radar range. It was larger than anything they had ever seen. It was sleek and dark, its design unlike any human-made craft. And behind it, hundreds more ships appeared, swarming like locusts in the vastness of space. The human crew stared in stunned silence. "By the stars," one of the officers whispered, unable to hide the fear in his voice. The fleet wasn't just big, it was massive, far more powerful than any human force could have ever imagined. The ship at the forefront of the enemy fleet was unlike anything the humans had ever built. Its dark, gleaming hull shimmered against the distant light of the stars, and the unmistakable hum of its engines sent a chill through the entire crew. "Prepare for impact," Captain Jace yelled, trying to steady his shaking hands. "Full power to the shields. Get us ready to fight. We won't go down without a fight." His command sent the crew into motion. Weapons were readied, shields powered up, and all systems were brought to full readiness. But even as they braced for the unknown, Jace knew deep down that this was only the beginning. The human fleet, though strong, would be up against something far more powerful than they had ever encountered before. The enemy fleet had arrived, and there would be no turning back. The human spirit. The bridge of the Valiant was filled with the buzz of urgent commands as the crew prepared for the battle they knew was coming. The immense enemy fleet loomed larger on the view screen, a silent reminder of the overwhelming force they were up against. The humans had faced many challenges, but this was different. The threat was too great for them to face alone. Captain Jace stood at the center of the bridge, staring out at the fleet. His jaw clenched, and his hands tightened around the armrests of his command chair. He wasn't sure they could win, but one thing was certain: they weren't going down without a fight. "We've trained for this," Jace said, his voice steady but filled with determination. He turned to face his crew. "I know we're up against something we've never seen before, but we are humans. We fight. We stand together. We don't give up." The crew, though nervous, nodded. There was a sense of unity that had been born in this moment. They had trained for the worst, but none of them had ever imagined facing an enemy like this. Yet here they were. They were the first line of defense for all of humanity. There was no room for fear now. Lieutenant Sarah stood at her post, her fingers moving over the console with practiced precision. She glanced at the radar. The enemy fleet had split into several smaller formations, each one moving in for a coordinated strike. Her heart pounded, but her mind was sharp. There was no time for hesitation. The first attack would come soon, and they needed to be ready. "Captain, I'm reading multiple enemy ships closing in," she reported. "We can't escape their range. They'll strike first." Jace's mind raced as he considered their options. The human fleet wasn't as vast, and they didn't have the same firepower. But humans had something the enemy didn't: their ingenuity and their spirit. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers," Jace ordered. "Get ready to engage. Fire on my mark." As the crew moved into action, the feeling of unity in the air was palpable. They may not have the same firepower, but they had something stronger: their will to fight and protect their home. In that moment, they knew that no matter what happened, they would stand together and face the enemy head-on. One by one, the crew members of the Valiant moved into their stations. The soldiers prepared for battle. The engineers checked the ship's systems, ensuring everything was in order. Every human on board understood that they were in for the fight of their lives, but they also knew that they couldn't let fear dictate their actions. As Jace looked around, he saw it: the unwavering confidence in their eyes. It was as if, despite the overwhelming odds, they were ready to show the galaxy just who they were. They were humans, and they would never give up. "Now, crew," Captain Jace said, his voice strong and calm, "we make our stand." In the cargo bay, the soldiers prepared their weapons. They were all too familiar with combat, but this was different. This wasn't just about protecting a planet or a colony. It was about protecting everything that humanity had built. They knew that their actions here could shape the future of the entire human race. Sergeant Mark, a veteran soldier, tightened his grip on his weapon and glanced at his team. "We fight for every human who came before us, and we fight for those who will come after us." The soldiers nodded, their resolve hardening. On the bridge, Sarah kept an eye on the enemy's movements. Their ships were getting closer, and every second felt like a lifetime. She could feel the tension building in her chest. She had always known that one day the humans would face a challenge like this, but she had never imagined it would happen so soon. And yet, here they were, standing on the brink of war, ready to prove their worth. "Enemy ships are within firing range," Sarah reported. "We're ready to fire, Captain." Jace's eyes locked onto the view screen. The enemy fleet was nearly upon them, their weapons already charging. The time to act was now. "Fire," Captain Jace commanded. The Valiant's weapons unleashed a barrage of powerful energy blasts. The enemy ships retaliated with their own strikes, and the battle began. The Valiant rocked with each hit, but it held strong. The crew, despite the pounding of the enemy's attacks, fought back with all their might. It was chaos, but it was also beautiful in its way. Humans fighting with everything they had, showing the universe that they would never back down. But as the battle raged on, it was clear the humans were outnumbered. Every enemy ship seemed to come at them from a different angle, and the Valiant was struggling to keep up with the onslaught. But there was one thing the enemy couldn't predict: the human spirit. "We might not win this fight," Captain Jace said, his voice gritty from the strain of battle. "But we will make them remember who we are." And that was enough. The enemy's first move. The battle had escalated quickly, and now it seemed like the universe itself was holding its breath. The Valiant was holding strong, but the weight of the enemy's assault was beginning to show. The ship shuddered with every hit, and yet it continued to fire back with all the strength its crew could muster. "Shields are at 75%, Captain," Sarah reported, her voice tight. "We can't keep taking hits like this." Jace gritted his teeth as he surveyed the battle unfolding on the view screen. The enemy ships, vast, powerful, and relentless, surrounded them on all sides. Every weapon they launched hit its target with deadly precision, and each blast seemed to draw them closer to the edge of defeat. But Jace wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. "Hold steady," Jace said, his voice calm but firm. "We're not finished. Get us into evasive maneuvers. Use the asteroid field to our advantage." The crew moved swiftly, maneuvering the Valiant through the dense asteroid belt that lay between them and the enemy fleet. The asteroids provided some cover, but it also meant more challenges. Dodging the massive rocks in their path while being pursued by such a well-coordinated fleet was no easy task. "We'll lose them in the debris," Sarah said. "It'll give us a few seconds to regroup." The ship jolted as it swerved, narrowly avoiding a collision with a large asteroid. The enemy ships were fast, but not as agile as the human craft. The Valiant weaved through the asteroid field, trying to make itself harder to target. Every second counted. Each maneuver was critical. As the ship ducked and dodged, Captain Jace kept a close eye on the tactical map. He could see the enemy ships adjusting their positions, trying to predict where the Valiant would go next. Their coordinated movements were impressive, almost like they had studied human tactics, anticipating each move. "Enemy ships are adjusting their course," Sarah said, her voice tinged with urgency. "They're learning our patterns. We won't be able to shake them much longer." Jace's mind raced. The enemy wasn't just attacking, they were studying. They were trying to figure out how humans fought. This wasn't just about power, it was about intelligence and adaptability. And they were facing an opponent that had already begun to predict their every move. "We need to do something unexpected," Jace said, more to himself than to anyone else. "We can't keep evading. It's time to take the fight to them." He turned to the weapons officer. "Get me a direct shot on their lead ship. Use everything we've got." "Captain, we don't have the firepower to break through their shields," the weapons officer warned. "Even if we hit them, we'll just be wasting energy." "We won't know until we try," Jace replied firmly. "Do it." With a slight nod, the officer began recalculating their firing angles. The Valiant's weapon systems hummed, charging for a high-powered strike. The crew was tense, each one aware of the risks involved. This could be their one chance to make a dent in the enemy fleet. Seconds ticked by, each one heavier than the last. "Target locked," the weapons officer called. "Firing now." The Valiant released a barrage of energy blasts, hurtling toward the lead enemy ship. It was a direct hit, but the enemy ship's shields held strong, deflecting most of the blast. The Valiant shook from the recoil, but they had made their mark. The enemy had felt it. The battle was no longer one-sided. The humans had struck back. Direct hit on their lead ship, but it didn't take down their shields, Sarah reported, her eyes glued to the radar. The enemy fleet responded immediately. Their lead ship unleashed a massive volley of energy beams, streaking through space toward the Valiant. The first shot struck the ship's shields, sending a violent shudder through the hull. But the Valiant's shields held. The ship wasn't going down yet. Shields at 50%. The crew shouted in unison. They're breaking through. We've got to keep moving, Captain Jace shouted. Evasive maneuvers. Keep us away from their firing line. But the enemy was relentless. They had learned their patterns, and now they were responding faster. The Valiant could still move, but with each twist and turn, the enemy fleet was on them, getting closer, closing in for the kill. The crew of the Valiant wasn't giving up, though. Every shot fired, every maneuver executed, was a testament to the human will to survive. They had made their stand, and now they would fight with everything they had. Enemy ships moving in for a final strike. Sarah called, her voice rising with alarm. Jace's eyes were locked onto the view screen. He could see it now. The lead enemy ship, larger than anything the humans had ever faced, was preparing its most powerful weapon. The Valiant's shields were weakening. They didn't have much time left. Brace for impact, Captain Jace shouted. We've got one shot at this. Battle escalates. The Valiant rocked violently as the enemy's barrage slammed against the shields once again. The human crew fought against the tremors, struggling to maintain control of the ship. The massive lead enemy ship, its weapons charged for another devastating strike, loomed ahead. Despite the pounding attacks, the crew refused to give up. They had one goal now: to survive long enough to make their counterattack count. Shields at 30%. We can't take much more of this, Sarah shouted over the noise of the systems groaning under the strain. Her hands were shaking, but her focus remained steady. She wasn't going to let fear overtake her now. Captain, the weapons officer called urgently. We're locked onto their lead ship. If we fire now, we can bypass their weaker outer shields. Jace's mind raced as he surveyed the situation. They were running out of time. The enemy had already shown their superior strength, and with every passing second, they were getting closer to overwhelming the human ship. The Valiant was already damaged, and the crew's energy reserves were draining fast. This was it, the turning point. They had to give everything they had to make a real impact. Do it, Captain Jace ordered, his voice cold but resolute. Give everything we've got. The weapons officer nodded, and the Valiant's cannons unleashed a full force of energy. The blast shot out at the lead enemy ship, a direct hit that rocked the enemy's shields. The power of the strike was enough to cause a brief ripple of hesitation in the enemy's movement. Direct hit. Their shields are weakening, the weapons officer shouted. The crew cheered for a moment, but the victory was short-lived. The enemy fleet didn't falter. They weren't backing down. They were preparing for the final strike. The battle was escalating. The remaining ships in the enemy fleet had now shifted their focus to the Valiant, surrounding it on all sides. They knew the humans would have one chance left. This was their moment to crush the human resistance once and for all. We can't outrun them, Sarah cried. They flanked us. We're surrounded. The situation was dire, but Captain Jace refused to accept defeat. He knew the odds were stacked against them, but humans had always found a way to fight back. He turned to his crew, his voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. We still have our most powerful weapon, our minds and our spirit. We're going to make them regret underestimating us. His words struck the crew hard. They were tired. Their ship was battered, and their weapons were running low on power. But they had one thing the enemy didn't: resilience, and that resilience would be enough to push them through. The Valiant darted through the oncoming fire, weaving through the enemy ships in a desperate but calculated attempt to escape the encirclement. The enemy fleet was fast, but the humans had trained for this kind of unpredictability. They used their environment, their agility, and their knowledge of warfare to their advantage. "Captain," Sarah called out, "I'm detecting a weakness in their fleet formation. The left flank is vulnerable. If we can break through, we might be able to disrupt their coordination." Jace's heart raced as he surveyed the tactical map on the screen. It was risky, but it was their only chance. They had to strike at the enemy's weakest point before they could fully regroup. "Take us through the left flank. Get us in there. Fast," Jace ordered, his voice sharp with command. The Valiant shot forward, threading through the gaps in the enemy's formation. The enemy ships were quick to respond, but they weren't expecting the Valiant to make such a bold move. In an instant, the human ship broke through the enemy's defenses, sending shockwaves through the tightly packed enemy vessels. "Direct hit on their left flank," the weapons officer called. "They're losing formation." The moment of chaos gave the Valiant's crew the opening they needed. The Valiant darted in and out of the enemy's range, dodging and weaving as they fired at the weakened enemy ships. Each strike found its mark, and the enemy began to falter. But the battle wasn't over yet. The enemy leadership, still intact and furious, launched another attack. The ship's massive weapons charged once again, aiming for the heart of the Valiant. "Brace for impact," Jace shouted as the ship's hull groaned under the strain of their rapid maneuvers. The Valiant swerved, just narrowly avoiding the devastating beam of energy from the enemy ship. The attack clipped the side of the Valiant, but the damage was far less than expected. "Shields down to 10%, Sarah reported, but her voice was filled with a new spark of determination. "We're still alive. We can still do this." Jace's eyes narrowed. The Valiant had been battered, and they had narrowly avoided total destruction, but now they had the advantage. The enemy was breaking apart. The humans had shown their true strength: unpredictable, courageous, and unrelenting. "Keep up the pressure," Jace ordered. "We won't stop until they know what it means to face the humans." The battle was far from over, but the tide had begun to turn. The Valiant was far from perfect, but its crew was more than ready to show the enemy just what humans were capable of. They had defied the odds so far, and now they were about to turn the battle into their favor. A turning point. The Valiant was battered, its hull creaking under the relentless assault from the enemy fleet. The crew was exhausted, but their spirits had not faltered. Despite the damage, despite the overwhelming numbers of enemy ships, they had found a way to fight back, a way to survive. But Captain Jace knew they were on borrowed time. The enemy fleet was relentless, and their firepower was devastating. The Valiant couldn't take much more. Just when the humans had begun to fear that this might be their last stand, the situation took a sudden and unexpected turn. "Captain, I'm detecting something," Sarah called, her voice tense with surprise. Jace turned quickly. "What is it?" "It's another fleet. It's human. And they're heading straight for us." The room fell into stunned silence. A second, larger fleet of human ships, one that hadn't been detected by the enemy, had appeared out of nowhere. The unexpected reinforcements were charging through the stars, cutting a path through the darkness. It was a sight no one had expected, but now it was their only hope. Are they ours?" Jace asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Sarah nodded, eyes wide in awe. "Yes, Captain. They're human, and they're armed to the teeth." The enemy fleet, caught off guard, immediately shifted focus toward the approaching reinforcements. But it was too late. The human fleet was already upon them. The powerful ships, including massive warships and advanced destroyers, tore through space with brutal precision, flanking the enemy and creating a storm of gunfire and energy blasts. "Reinforcements are here," one of the crew members shouted in triumph. Jace's face broke into a rare smile. The fight wasn't over. The human spirit had proven itself again, showing the enemies that even when things seemed hopeless, humanity could always rise to the challenge. "Get us back into the fight," Captain Jace ordered. "We got to help them push through. We're not done yet." The Valiant surged forward, joining the battle once again. The enemy, now split between their initial assault on the Valiant and the threat of the reinforcements, was losing ground quickly. Their ships were retreating in disarray, unable to keep up with the combined power of the two human fleets. "Target their weaker vessels," Jace ordered. "Don't give them time to regroup." The Valiant fired relentlessly, its weapons striking down enemy ships one by one. The humans were relentless, outnumbering the enemy fleet for the first time in the battle. They began to turn the tide, pushing the enemy back, and the fear of defeat slowly lifted from the human crew's shoulders. But the enemy leadership, the massive ship that had been directing the assault, was still there. Its weapons were firing, and its shields were holding strong. The leadership had yet to give up, and it was clear the enemy would fight to the last. "Sarah, can you get a reading on their leadership?" Jace asked. "I need to know if there's a weak spot." Sarah's eyes darted over her console. "I'm working on it, Captain. Hold on. They'd got heavy shielding, but there's a gap near their weapons array. If we can hit it with full force, we can disable their firepower." Jace's mind raced. If they could disable the leadership, the remaining enemy fleet would scatter. The human reinforcements were powerful, but without the leader, the enemy fleet would lose their coordination. "Take us in," Jace commanded. "We've got one shot at this." The Valiant shot forward, breaking through the enemy lines with newfound confidence. The crew, every member, worked together with incredible precision. The massive enemy leadership loomed ahead, its weapons charging for another devastating attack. "Get ready to fire," Jace called. "On my mark." The crew's hands were steady, and their focus was laser-sharp. They had one chance, and they weren't going to waste it. The Valiant raced toward the gap in the enemy ship's defenses. "Now," Jace shouted. The Valiant unleashed its most powerful strike yet. The energy blast shot through the darkness, colliding directly with the vulnerable gap in the enemy ship's shields. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The energy blast connected with the enemy leader's ship's weapons array, and the resulting explosion rocked the entire battlefield. The leadership's massive guns went dark, and its shields flickered. The once imposing presence of the leadership began to falter. "Direct hit. The leadership's firepower is down," Sarah called out, her voice filled with awe. The enemy fleet, now without its command structure, fell into chaos. The human reinforcements, who had been fighting valiantly, took full advantage. The enemy ships scattered, fleeing into the depths of space, no longer able to maintain the fight. Captain Jace watched as the battle shifted in their favor. The human fleets, against all odds, had turned the tide. The enemy fleet, once so powerful, was now retreating, broken and disorganized. But even as the humans celebrated their victory, Captain Jace knew that this was only one battle in a much larger war. There would be more enemies, more challenges ahead. But for today, they had proven something important. No matter the odds, no matter the enemy, the human spirit would always rise to face the challenge. And that was a message that would be heard across the galaxy. The final victory and message. The dust of battle settled over the wreckage of the once formidable enemy fleet. The Valiant, though battered and scarred, stood tall, its hull gleaming in the dim light of distant stars. The silence that followed the chaos was almost as overwhelming as the battle itself. For a moment, it seemed as if time had stopped. The crew aboard the Valiant took a collective breath, their hearts pounding from the sheer intensity of the fight they had just survived. They had done it. Against all odds, humanity had proven its strength and resilience. "Enemy fleet retreating," Sarah reported, her voice a mix of exhaustion and relief. They've scattered into deep space. We've won, Captain. Captain Jace allowed himself a small smile as he surveyed the damage control reports on the screens before him. The Valiant was still functional, though barely. It would take time to repair the ship, but that was a problem for tomorrow. For now, victory belonged to the humans. He turned to the crew, his voice strong despite the weight of the battle they had just endured. We faced the impossible and come out on top, but we did it because we believed in each other. We fought not just for survival, but to prove that the human spirit cannot be crushed. The crew's faces lit up with pride and relief. The battle had been fierce, and many had feared that they would be overwhelmed. But in the end, the humans had fought with the strength that had always defined them: determination, courage, and an unbreakable will. We didn't just survive, Jace continued. We sent a message to anyone who thinks they can take us down. The humans will always rise, no matter how dark it seems. And no one, not even the largest fleet in the galaxy, can break us. The room fell silent as the crew absorbed his words. They had fought against impossible odds, and now they had the chance to send a message of strength, unity, and hope. A message that would echo throughout the galaxy. Captain, there's a transmission coming through from the human command fleet, Sarah said, her voice filled with surprise. They've received our distress signal. Patch it through, Jace replied, turning his attention to the comm system. A crackling sound filled the room, and soon the face of an admiral appeared on the screen. Captain Jace, this is Admiral Sinclair of the human command fleet. I'm receiving reports of the battle's outcome. You've done the impossible. Your victory is sending shockwaves throughout the galaxy. The enemy fleet is in disarray, and we have already begun coordinating a counteroffensive to follow up on your success. Jace nodded, his chest swelling with pride. Thank you, Admiral. We couldn't have done it without the reinforcements. It was a combined effort, and the humans proved that we are a force to be reckoned with. The Admiral's face softened. Indeed, your actions today will go down in history, and we'll be there to back you up, Captain. The fight is far from over, but with what you've accomplished, we now have the momentum. The enemy will never forget what you've done. Jace's gaze shifted to the crew, standing tall and proud around him. They had been through so much: sacrifice, fear, and doubt. But they had never wavered. They had kept fighting, kept pushing forward. And now, the galaxy would remember their names. We will keep fighting, Admiral, Jace said, for our people, for our future. As the transmission ended, Captain Jace turned to Sarah, who had already begun organizing the next steps. The Valiant had won, but the war was far from over. The victory they had achieved today was just the beginning. The crew's work was far from finished. They had taken the first step toward a brighter future, but there were more battles to fight, more enemies to face, more tests of humanity's will. Yet in that moment, one thing was clear: the humans had proven to the universe that they would not go quietly into the night, and the galaxy would remember the message they had sent. The human spirit could not, and would not, be broken. The battle was over, but the war for humanity's future had just begun.